Todd Brewster's latest book just launched. It is both a powerful study of American childhood and a beautiful gallery of extraordinary photography. American Childhood is a terrific addition to an underappreciated part of American history. So officially, Todd is, as we all know, a veteran journalist, a historian who has worked as an editor for Time and Life, and a senior producer, of course, for ABC News. He is the co-author with Peter Jennings of the #1 New York Times bestselling book, The Century, which spent nearly 1 year on the bestseller list. The author of the acclaimed Lincoln's Gamble, and co-author with Mark Lamont Hill of Seen and Unseen, Technology, Social Media, and the Fight for Racial Justice, which we recorded, and some of you were in person as well as online right here at RJ Julia. Thank you for that. Brewster was the founding director of the Center for Oral History at West Point and the executive producer of Into Harm's Way, an award-winning documentary about the West Point class of 1967. He has taught journalism at Cooper Union, Temple University, and Mount Holyoke College, a native of Indianapolis. Brewster now lives in Connecticut. As I was preparing for tonight, I thought back to my political science undergraduate times and thought about so much that Todd has brought to us as readers. And today we will hear more about how and why Todd is bringing us not only history, fame, and anonymity, as well as photos from both flea markets and archives. So aren't we fortunate to have Todd with us to be together for this conversation? And thankfully, we will have time for Q&A. So now I'll bring it over to you, Todd. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. Thank you so much. It's a thrill to be here at RJ Julia for another visit and another book. And I'm going to go ahead with my formal presentation as I would. We have a very small, intimate group. By the way, Ken, you asked a question about this photograph with the bubbles being blown here. 1970s, done by a photographer named Susan Salas, who befriended these girls on the streets of Little Italy in the 1970s. And she never actually went to their homes. They were always just on the streets. She would just come home from assignments and she continued to photograph them as a kind of project. And she watched them grow up. They're now mothers in their own right and middle-aged, and she stayed in touch with them. I mean, the whole series of her photographs called The Prince Street Girls, and this is part of that series. So it's the next of the series of photographs, and it's a great choice for the cover, I feel. Shows both the irreverence and the innocence of youth, I think, at the same time. Let's switch to the next slide. I want to show there's a wonderful 1937 Rodgers and Hart musical, rarely staged anymore. Go on to the next one. Yeah. Called Babes in Arms. It tells the story of a group of children whose parents, all vaudeville performers, have left them home alone for months while they travel the regional theater circuit. When the local sheriff tells the children that they must go on to work, go to a work farm to earn their keep, the kids decide instead to raise money by putting on a musical. Preposterous, I know, but it is Broadway. Babes in Arms, which is often credited with establishing let's put on a show genre that led to so many stage and movie hits, featured several songs that would go on to become durable standards, among them Where or When, The Lady's a Tramp, My Funny Valentine. But the musical's inspiration is what interests me here. According to the admittedly make-believe world of the press release, Richard Rodgers and Lorenz Hart had been charmed when on a stroll through Central Park they came upon some children performing inventive games of their own imagination. This prompted the men to think of what the world would be like if children could simply run free. The result was Babes in Arms, a story where the kids do just fine without parental supervision. In fact, they thrive. The film version of Babes in Arms starred Judy Garland and Mickey Rooney. Could it have been anybody else? But the staged version featured child actress Mitzi Green, seen here with Clara Bow. That's Mitzi Green on the left. Green had already made something of a name for herself in Hollywood when she appeared in the filmed version of Tom Sawyer at the age of 12 as little orphan Annie. Green also did hilarious impressions of adult performers like Maurice Chevalier, which you can still find on YouTube. But while her pixie looks made her appear younger, Green was 17 when she performed at Babes in Arms and nearing the end of a career built on childish appeal. She went on to become a modestly successful lounge singer and television actress. It was never as popular as she was as a youngster, a common professional trajectory for the child star. Think of Shirley Temple or Macaulay Culkin. It seems that once seasoned by a few hormones, child performers find their careers slowly beginning to evaporate. Green died in 1969 at the age of 49. So what is it about children that so fascinates us? I don't mean the narcissistic act of spawning a living thing in one's own image. That, of course, is another subject. No, I'm thinking of the developmental stage of childhood that denotes it as a separate period of life. We in our time and our place look at childhood with curiosity and awe, as if the children are not simply less realized forms of life than the ones that we ourselves inhabit, adults in waiting, but some glorious separate thing awash in insight and uncensored creativity. We didn't always feel that way. Certainly not everyone does today, but as a culture, we now glorify, maybe even idealize childhood, believing that children see things that the rest of us don't see, that they have ideas that the rest of us would never even contemplate. And in an 1898 edition of the Albany, Missouri Ledger, there's an idle reference to a little girl 4 years old. She go to the next picture, if you could, Kathy, who says she knows what drawing is. You just think something and then you run a line around your think. Back then, the editors of the Ledger, 1898, this is, likely saw this as humorous filler. Today, we're apt to recognize it justifiably for its elegance of thought. We watch children with amazement. Take, for instance, this description from the journalist Luke Moguson, writing about the resourcefulness of Iranian refugee children living in a rancid Jakarta apartment complex where they had been smuggled en route to asylum in Australia. This is the quote: "A feather duster found beneath the sink made for a superb tickling instrument. Plastic grocery bags were turned into balloons. The hot sauce packets, including every ration of instant noodles, could be squirted on the tabletop to create very interesting designs. There were giant roaches and tailless cats to chase, and most delightfully, there was a pool. Since the children didn't have bathing suits, they swam in their underwear, used a spare dishcloth to dry themselves off, and removed a length of flexible tubing from the back of our air conditioner, repurposing it as a snorkel. Oh, and I mentioned it, the kids apparently didn't know how to swim." Or consider, if we could move on to the next slide, Kathy, this 1912 shot of a group of children at a school for the blind in Philadelphia who, undaunted by their disability, are playing a game of hide and seek. School still exists, by the way. Next slide, please, Kathy. Leroy Wiley Gresham was rendered unable to walk by an accident. Spent his youth as an invalid, but began a diary at the age of 13 that is among the most vivid and intimate accounts of the Civil War. Restricted to his bed or to a wagon which was pulled around Macon, Georgia by a slave, Gresham discusses troop movements and eventually Sherman's march to Atlanta, all while charting the future decline of his health, an invaluable record, as it turned out, for historians to understand the 19th century treatment of disease and marking the vicissitudes of life. Next one, please. Laura Jernigan, 5 years old, kept a diary when she went with her family on a 3-year whaling trip in 1868 that took her from New Bedford, Massachusetts, all the way around to Alaska. That's Laura on the left there. Like her father, 15-year-old Annie Brown, seen here over here with her mother and sister, that's Annie on the left, dreamed of ending slavery. So she and her sister-in-law, Martha, 17, traveled from the family home in North Elba, New York, to manage the Maryland farm where in 1859, John Brown, her father, and his sons plotted to seize the federal armory at Harper's Ferry and incite a slave insurrection. Then a few years later, after the raid had failed and John Brown had been hanged, Annie Brown returned to Virginia, where in the middle of the Civil War, she taught contraband slave children, those freed by the Union Army. And in an irony too rich for fiction, did so in a makeshift schoolhouse that was once the home to the judge who had sentenced her father to death. Next slide. Of the thousands of underage soldiers in the Civil War, Johnny Clem, that's Clem on the right there, was the youngest, only 10 years old. When he presented himself for service, Clem was accepted by the 22nd Michigan Infantry as a regimental mascot and an emergency drummer boy. Called into action in the 1863 Battle of Chickamauga, he encountered a Confederate officer who attempted to capture him, but instead Clem wounded the rebel. He survived the war and eventually became a brigadier general. Other child soldiers in the Civil War were not as fortunate. Ed Jamison, on the left there, of the 2nd Louisiana Infantry Regiment, enlisted at 16 and died at the Battle of Malvern Hill in 1862. This photograph of him here, with its striking innocence, has become one of the most famous of the war itself. But even this honor eluded his family until the early 1990s. For more than 100 years, it had been misidentified. A greater willingness to contemplate what might be instead of accepting what is constitutes one way, perhaps, that the mind of a child is distinguished from the mind of an adult. Throughout human history, it has proved to be the engine of some great creativity. Superman was dreamt up by 2 nerdy Jewish teenagers at Glenville High School in Cleveland. As the daughter of a local oil producer in Western Pennsylvania, Ida Tarbell watched her father's business get squashed by John D. Rockefeller. Convinced at 15 that privilege inevitably led to corruption and injustice, Tarbell went on to become one of the first groundbreaking investigative journalists in American history, with her greatest achievement being a takedown of Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company. Consider the story of Edwin Armstrong. Let's move on to the next slide. One of several teenage pioneers of radio. Like many boys of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Armstrong had been inspired by Ray Stannard Baker's 1899 book, The Boy's Book of Inventions, a profusely illustrated volume whose influence went beyond that of a technical manual, in part because Baker seemed to understand children so well, and in part because the inventive possibilities he described there, a machine to liquefy and freeze air, an X-ray camera, bat-wing contraption that allowed the person wearing it to leap from mountaintops and glide to the ground, were not mere mechanical achievements. They were solutions to some of the most elemental restrictions of human life: space, time, distance. And they set the childish imagination spinning. There's a reason why such ideas are called dreams, why magic shows are considered children's entertainment, why we call the person who tamps down such fevered visions and sets plans on a seemingly unreasonable path to be the adult in the room. Housebound by health issues, Armstrong tinkered in his family's Yonkers, New York attic, assembling a wireless transmitter that he used to communicate with other wireless enthusiasts in his circle of friends. Heights fascinated him. From the attic window of his home on Warburton Avenue, he could see far up the Hudson River. But from the top of the 125-foot antenna he would build in his family's backyard, he could survey all the Hudson Valley and breathe in the air, the same air that his contraptions tapped to mysteriously carry his voice. Socially awkward, given to exhibiting a pronounced twitch, making him pronounced twitch brought on by his battle with St. Vitus's disease that caused involuntary contortions of the muscles. Armstrong became the talk of Yonkers when he would strap himself in a bosun's chair and, like a rock climber, propel up the edifice of the tower to relax at its top. But climbing was no idle interest. In 1938, Armstrong would build yet another tower, this one a 400-foot projectile in Alpine, New Jersey, where he would conduct the experiments that led to his invention of FM radio. That tower still stands. And in 2001, when the attack upon the World Trade Center destroyed transmitters in Lower Manhattan, it was the Armstrong Tower that was put into service as a temporary transmitter for both television and radio. So over the past 5 years, I've been gathering up vintage images of children. We move on to the next picture. Some that stared out to me from piles of picked over baskets at flea markets and thrift shops, others that I discovered scouring the digital archives of the Library of Congress, the New York Public Library, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the New York Historical Society, and dozens of smaller historical collections that we found on the internet. I looked through the work of the world's most distinguished photojournalism agency, Magnum, and of Getty Images, which is the owner now of the Bettman Archive, the world's largest vintage photo repository. Next page. I stole glances at the pictures of children framed and hung on friends' and relatives' living room, bathroom, and stairwell walls, where positioned lovingly on end tables. I scoured ancestry.com, findagrave.com, and picture sites like shorpy.com and ancientfaces.com that invite people to post old snapshots, including one site with the oxymoronic name Vintage News Daily. I surfed through the listings on eBay, looking at pages from old high school yearbooks and sifted through the mostly cheesy images on Tumblr sites with the names like Yesterday's Print and Vintage Everyday. I skimmed community bulletin boards and examined biographies of the famous and the not so famous for pictures of great adventures and artists, politicians, army generals, actors, and notorious criminals as they appeared in their youths. Next image, please. And in adolescence is often all gangly and coltish, ignorant, of course, of their future fame or infamy. That's Ernest Hemingway at the age of 12, writing a story while on a fishing trip. On the right is childhood Ted Kaczynski, who not to become a unicorn. And slowly I assembled all of them, 2,033 in all, on my own Tumblr site that I kept under lock and key. My aim was to construct a carefully edited, highly subjective, highly selective photographic history of the life of the American child, accompanied by an extended essay on the history of that elusive period of life and America's peculiar place in it. As I worked, I rejected all manner of calendrical boilerplate, that wonderful evocative phrase of my former colleague in American Heritage, Richard Snow, that is, no boy with a bowl of spaghetti drooling over his head, no teenage lovers walking dreamily through a garden of daisies, no cute puppies playing with even cuter babies. I avoided the all too famous images as well, the kind that once carried great power, but like a hit song played too often, have been rendered tiresome and in some cases banal. My objective was to surprise and inform, not comfort or amuse. This book is about children, but it's also about America. I concluded I have snapshots to help to form the personal and family myths we all carry around with us, and they do. Or why do we choose one picture to frame and hang and not another? Then it can be said that photojournalism provides substance to our national myths. Indeed, glancing through this volume, next picture, please, you'll see pictures that mark the recognized rhythms of the American stories of mother and child during the Great Depression. Next one. Famous Lewis Hine images of child labor. The child joins the society from the crib, and yet because children experience the world differently than adults do, the American story here has a subtlety and a nuance that will at times make it feel unfamiliar, maybe even new again. My project wasn't just to look, it was to come to terms with what I saw and read, to find a theme that helps all this make sense. I arrived at the rather bold declaration that Americans invented childhood, that is, a period of life cordoned off from full maturity, covered with a veil of protection and subject to a program of nurture. And that now, sadly, we may be presiding over its demise. Next picture, please. Next, that's a Black Panther school in Oakland, California. Next one. It's a boy in Chicago. Next one. That's an active shooter drill in Montana. America was the first great experiment in government to grow out of the Enlightenment, its respect for the individual self. Before the Enlightenment, children were considered only to be adults in waiting. You'll find out more about that idea in this book. Next picture. So what do we learn about children by just looking at the pictures in this volume? There's the obvious yet always revelatory fact that children make great photographic subjects. They do because they are guileless, or at least what the adults see as guileless, and because, like dancers or acrobats or people fleeing the police or running from buildings about to collapse, all great photographic subjects, by the way, children move. You won't see that by examining any pictures here that any picture here was taken before, say, 1920, because movement was impossible to capture until then. But once freed from the bounds of slow film speeds, photographs show us the extraordinary ways in which children occupy and communicate with their bodies, leaping, climbing, engaging in mock and sometimes real warfare, and imagining they can do all kinds of things we aged ones know are impossible. Aren't they impossible? When my tenancy of a male body was fairly new, of 6 or so years duration, the writer John Updike once recalled, I used to jump and fall just for the joy of it. Falling is, after all, a kind of flying, though briefer duration than would be ideal. Or to quote Buzz Lightyear, flying is falling with style. This is from a series done by a photographer named Joseph Szabo called Almost Grown. And it's about teenagers on Long Island. There's some girls, 1970s again. Next picture too. And some boys getting out here on a joyride, right? Another discovery is that children are their own beings, following their own impulses and designs, listening to their own music, believing in their own God or no God, and waking each day with a dream they would like to realize. That is the story that is told here too. Next picture. This is a picture of graffiti in a textbook in the middle of the late 19th century, showing the capture of Jefferson Davis, who was rumored to have dressed up like a woman in order to evade his pursuers. Next one, please. And this is a picture from the 1960s of a family that I just think is done by Elliot Irwin, a great photographer. As I said in the text, the father is obviously clearly enamored of his position in society. The son is to the left is on the way there. His wife is certainly showing just enough leg to be appropriate. And on the right is the real child of the rub who's got his impish grin and is wearing white socks to a formal photograph here. A third lesson that comes from all these words and pictures is the timelessness of childhood. This is a history, yes. When I look at the picture of the teenage Lincoln assassin conspirator, Lincoln Lewis Powell, next picture, please. I swear that I saw him last week starting the hallways of our local high school, baseball cap propped backward on his head, a sparse pattern of stubble protruding from his chin. Or maybe he was the one I saw bagging groceries at Stop and Shop. No, he rode next to me, AirPods propped above his earlobes, head back in somnambulant reverie on the D train. Likewise, I look at the picture of the very young, next one, Lady Gaga, standing before the family fireplace, and think that I saw her on a more graceful expression in a 19th century daguerreotype I found in the Library of Congress's prints and photographs collection. Maybe that she is a few years older as one of the Prince Street girls in the pictures on our cover from photographer Susan Basalis series that captured life in the streets of New York's Little Italy in the 1970s. Throughout the book, a persistent theme is how often adult success or failure is predicated on inspiration from childhood, by an idea too rich and implausible for an adult mind to consider, or by a childhood trauma that nags and tugs for the remainder of life. From that perspective, childhood is where we live. Adulthood is where we make sense of it, always looking for the road that will take us back. Many years ago, I was assigned by a magazine to write about Bart Giamatti, the erudite Major League Baseball commissioner who had once been the president of Yale. In between puffs on one of the cigarettes that likely led to his early death at 51 in 1989, Bart gave great copy, as I knew he would. This was a man who spoke in complete sentences, thought in whole paragraphs, when left his job at the highest level of academia to serve as the chief steward of a child's game, simply because he cared about it so deeply. As he waxed on about his affection for a sport whose origins are shrouded in mystery, Giamatti looked at me and said, "What genius decided to call it fourth base home plate? Yeah, who recognized that home is both where we start and where we seek to return." Two more pictures before we next one. Very fanciful, wonderful picture of a photographer out in Minnesota. A group of children were home for the day. I think it may have even been during COVID, and they were watching the Beatles documentary. One of them had an idea. They went out. Here we are. Those of you who are old enough to know what this is mimicking. And the final, the final picture. There we go. This is the Hudson River Pier, and that is the baby there is the man sitting here in this chair right now. My father, and that's my older brother. That's the River Pier. Thanks very much.
Very wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Questions that you would like to pose?
What was the inspiration to start this? It's a fascinating journey, obviously, and the research and just the places you described. Yeah, I'm sure it was fun just to.
Yeah, I an editor at a different publishing house had this idea of what was it like for children to experience history, and asked me if I was interested in pursuing that. I didn't really think it was something that would interest me so much, but I decided to go ahead and just do some reading about it. And as I did, I started to understand that how American history had valued children. Children have been a key part of our development. I mean, the markets for, the idea of special clothing for children, special literature for children, that all emerged in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. The idea of a popular culture came out of inspiration for children. The idea of being a teenager was itself an American invention. School used to stop, of course, at the 8th grade, but the extension of it, mandatory schooling, the extension of it into through the high school years meant that we had another section of childhood that emerged, right? That we called the teenager. And then there was a whole teen culture that emerged out of that. Just think of popular culture in the middle part of the 20th century with the arrival, particularly the 1950s, with the arrival of rock and roll. Even a little before that, with the jazz age, you can see that there was increasingly this focus on children as the drivers of our popular culture and the drivers of our culture in general. And so I began to see it as it was a subject that had real depth, real roots. And I've always been interested in photography, always loved photography, always loved that I'm interested in technology, from my other work. So I was interested in seeing the role of technology in telling this story. And, it's really, I referred before that you couldn't take pictures of anything moving until the early part, almost sort of late, like 1920s, 1930s, before the film speeds are fast enough to capture any kind of movement. So you really, it's like the camera suddenly was, and increasingly, it was coming into focus what a child's life was because of what we were able to do with the camera, or that you couldn't. Back in the 19th century, most of the pictures of children, like most of the pictures of everyone, are these very stilted, sort of formal photographs of where people would go with their families for the family photograph that would be taken in the studio. You had to sit still for a long period of time. And it was also often the only presentation you would have to the rest of the world, or even to posterity, of who you were. So there was a great sense of artifice attached to it. Like, I'm going to show what I want to be thought of for the future. And those are interesting. They're interesting for what they demonstrate. And there's lots of them on the internet you can find now, where they're unlabeled, unmarked, and you kind of can do some sleuthing to understand who they are, who the people are in the picture. And I had great fun doing that. Library of Congress collection of old daguerreotypes is just remarkable. Tracking down who they are is with the arrival of things like Ancestry and all these other sites has made it a wonderful adventure. But it was that inspiration, seeing that there was more depth to the subject, that really inspired me. And I thought that book of photography, particularly off the Library of Congress collection, which is increasingly online, and the Library of Congress has tons and tons of photographs and prints, but they're gradually digitizing it. Now there's millions of images there now, but every day there's more, right? And so out of that you can find out quite a bit. It was a subject that really had not been done. And I guess the third reason would be that I look back at all the books that have been done about picture books that have been done about children, and they tended to be reinforcing sort of the parental idea of what a child should be, rather than my original idea of this book was through the eyes of children. I wanted to capture some of that irreverence that children have, some of that spunk, some of that willingness to sort of buck rules and traditions, and how adults don't understand children, and how that's represented by the way that children respond to things. So there's the three big inspirations, and like any subject, the reasons for it sort of organically move as you develop it over time. And I spent many years on this book because it was something that when I did this book about Lincoln, I thought I would do this book next for pretty quickly, but with the introduction of life events of my own, and then the pandemic and everything, it ends up getting, and also because I got deeper and deeper and deeper into it, which changed everything about how I thought of it. Other questions?
I'm wondering how this is really sort of not really the subject of the book, but about the interaction between Americans' ideas about childhood, but also Americans' idea about child rearing, from Dr. Spock to all these people. Have been a lot of changes in the way people
There have.
say you should. I don't know much about that, but My wife talked about it a lot. I read a number of
Yeah.
books.
I'm not prepared really to talk about that. I don't think I know enough about it. There's been interesting books recently. I think Jill Lepore may have done a book about.
Yeah, I think so,
her-
yeah, I think
yeah.
I didn't
But
read it,
I thought you were gonna ask something very different.
Well, I was gonna, to be honest, this is really not about, it's about, when it came to Armstrong,
Yes,
I mean, I grew up about 8 miles from that tower.
the one in New Jersey.
Yeah.
Yeah, really. So you know of it. You knew about the Armstrong.
Well, I remember, I'm old enough to remember when FM first became widely
Yeah.
available right after World War II.
Yeah,
We had all these broadcasts and he had a lot of frustration as he got older. He wasn't, I didn't know about his St. Vitus.
yes.
I didn't
St.
know
Vitus'
about that.
stance, I'm
I
sorry.
knew these people just said when they talked that he was a strange man, I thought.
Yeah.
This maybe, I thought I heard that he committed
He
suicide.
did.
He jumped off that tower. Now, that may not be.
I'm
true.
not sure about that, but
I'm not sure, but I remember hearing
Yeah.
about that, and my parents, and other people who talked about him. And I never knew much about him, except that he was strange, and he always was, I think he was referred to by a military title, Major Armstrong. I don't know if
Yeah.
that's a long time ago,
yeah,
but when I saw that, I hadn't thought about him.
he got in a lot of legal fights with Sarnoff and others.
Yeah, he
over-
lost,
Yes.
he lost out to
Yes.
Sarnoff and
Yes,
people, and felt,
yes.
felt,
He felt with very bitter
felt
man.
he was.
Very
a
bitter.
man,
Yes,
for good reason,
yes.
and that's not. what-
I thought you were gonna have something different, which is, how do American ideas about childhood compare with those of other cultures, European culture? And of course, a lot of it is derived from Europeans, like Locke and Rousseau are the principal people who have written about childhood, and that really inspired some of the thinking, and there's a lot about that in the book, so there's,
I've always noticed that the portraits you see of children in the 18th century,
yeah.
they look like little adults. I mean, they don't look.
Yeah, so that's
They're
a
just
phrase adults in
small.
waiting you find all the time, which is people that are, that they just really didn't consider childhood to be a separate sphere of life, and any catering to it was considered to be sort of hampering or, not.
There was a historian named, I don't know if he's still alive, I think it was Lawrence Stone,
Yes,
who wrote books about family.
yes,
And I remember, I didn't read them, but Margaret
yeah,
didn't like them much, and he was quite controversial, but he claimed that people's attitudes were partly the children were not cherished in the same way or even loved. And I don't, a lot of people say that's just wrong,
mhm,
but because they had big families of high infant mortality, so many children died young of diphtheria, and sort of.
Yeah.
Father's family, mother died of scarlet fever, all these things.
yeah, there's some theories that
But that the attitude toward children changed as infant mortality decreased.
yes, exactly, because as infant mortality, it makes sense that if there's a high infant mortality rate, that you would probably be defended against being too attached to your child, because you're gonna, good chance you're gonna
Right.
lose them.
Right. Todd, I was gonna say, I'm sorry, I'm like,
That's all
I
right.
had some work stuff going on, honey.
Yeah, this is Tina,
Um,
Tina Barber.
But it's funny, it's so timely, this whole topic, because my daughter has just turned 18.
Yeah,
She's reading the Malala book and talking about a different childhood, right?
yeah,
And then we have a French family that's coming to stay with us during the summer, and they have 2 little boys, and I've had them sign up for summer camp. And I start thinking about the topic, and you're right, like things like summer camp are an alien to the
Yes.
Europeans, that we do this, we ship our kids off,
Yes.
so, that kind of thing.
of course, they ship their kids off to school, so.
And I actually grew up in London in the 70s.
Yeah.
And I remember I was older than the neighbor. He was 8, but he was shipped off to boarding school, and I was
Yeah.
going to the American school in London.
Yeah.
And I couldn't believe it. I thought, how can they send their child off at 8 years old to be gone? But I guess I have a question for you. Do you think our childhood, specifically the American childhood, is built out of some sort of idyllic fantasy of what it should be, it's in a suspended reality?
Well, that's interesting. What I discussed earlier was how this notion that.
I'm sorry.
That's all right, Americans invented childhood, and that this notion of a separate, what you're referring to as idyllic sphere of life, but I think that many of the thinkers at the time thought it was a period in which you could gestate, in a sense, into your real self,
Right.
which was an American notion, they're very much an Enlightenment notion, but also really realized here much more than or idealized here more than in other cultures, with the idea that we value the individual so much that the individual needs time to form as an individual, right? And so we idealized it too much. I think, well, we may find out, because I think we've kind of lost that now. I mean, I think we've now gotten to the point where this is part of the theme of the book, is that
Right.
that we're presiding over its demise, or the demise of that idea at any rate.
But let me throw something bothers
Yeah.
you, that we, being the baby boomers, I'm on the tail end of the baby
Yeah.
boomers, we all chuckle and mutter under our breath, having worked with millennials,
Yeah.
okay? That these guys are not prepared for real life, that
Yeah.
there was something about our childhood where we were free to be independent.
Yeah,
You were able to roam in people's backyards.
yeah,
I remember when I grew up in London in the seventies, mom and dad, I took the tube and I
Yeah.
was 12
Yeah.
through the city to school,
Yeah.
or I hopped on a double-decker bus. And then contrast me as a mom,
yeah,
standing at the end of the
Yeah.
bus stop because I'm terrified a white van is gonna come and take her away. I
Yeah.
mean, I think these younger generations have lost something in the translation of what childhood has become now.
yeah. Very interesting. I mean, there's two ways of looking at that. One is that, our overprotection is way out of whack with reality, right? And that in so doing, we're kind of disallowed them from letting their imaginations run and to be lost.
And make
right?
mistakes.
And make mistakes.
Because mistakes could
Yeah.
be fatal.
Yeah.
That kind of mentality.
Yeah.
I succumb to it once in a while.
Yeah, of course, we all do, and there's some sort of, there's a sense, I think, in part, this goes to one of the telling issues in our this moment, of course, is that the technology of our age has contributed to this sense of impending doom at all levels. And there's a lot of writing about how when radio was introduced, that it penetrated the home. Suddenly the walls of the home were not protective anymore from the world outside, because the world outside was coming in. Granted, it was a voice of Edward R. Murrow, whatever,
Right.
coming from London, but nonetheless, suddenly the sounds of bombs during World War II were being heard in villages in towns in Iowa, where people were raising their children in a way that never happened before.
Right.
Well, now contrast that to now, when we feel that there are predators at our doorstep. We feel that every piece of violence somehow is imminent and in our own lives.
Or something happens in Uvalde, Texas, it's gonna
Yes.
impact me,
Yes,
right?
yeah.
Or my child.
Yeah.
If they happen to them, it could happen to me.
Well, it's because of the randomness of it, right?
Yeah.
I mean, well, we live not far from Sandy Hook, so for us, it was very real, and I will always remember driving the car with our younger son in the backseat with a friend, and him turning to him and saying, "Have you figured out where you're gonna hide if there's a shooter who comes into our classroom?"
Alex was in Washington, Connecticut, which was just Toontown when it happened, in the same grade. So it struck us the
Yeah.
same way.
It happened in Washington.
Washington, Connecticut.
I know one.
Yeah, that's right.
What happened there?
No, Newtown was just a few.
Oh,
towns
yeah,
over,
right, yeah.
So,
Yeah, well, it's probably about 20 miles.
Oh.
away,
so
maybe
that,
a little bit
I
more.
know exactly what you're saying.
Yeah. But there's no greater reason for it to happen simply because of well, I guess you could argue there's a greater reason for it to happen. I don't know if the statistics are that, so I shouldn't speak to this,
Right.
but I'll be bold enough to do it anyway. That there may be a greater reason for it to happen in states where the gun control laws are so lax that people are having open carries, right?
Right.
There may be in places where the guns are proliferating at greater amounts than they are in the state of Connecticut, let's say. But it still is a random act.
Sure.
It still is an unusual act. It's not something that we would,
We make it seem more usual with the proliferation of media, I think.
right? Well, because now the media that we talked about before is penetrating, like World War II penetrated. Now it's all this stuff that's penetrating it, right?
Right.
And it's not only doing that, it's going individually to the lives of our children, who are seeing all kinds of things because they have a media life separate from us. that they didn't have in past generations.
Yeah.
They have their own media life.
Right,
It used to be that watching television or listening to radio was a family event, a communal event.
right,
Now it's an individual event.
right.
So every child has, and we don't know what's going on. None of us have the ability to sort of monitor, nor would we want to, because I think it deprives a certain privacy of a child's
It's a
life.
catch-22, isn't
It
it?
is.
And I guess my question when I came running in here and knowing you were gonna do this, is the theme in the book with nostalgic for wanting the old days, or is it a critical look of how it different generations like, had a different experience versus now? I'm just curious where you came from.
I'd like to feel it's not nostalgic,
Okay,
because I don't like the overtones with that.
okay,
But if appreciation for the specialness of childhood as a moment when the imagination can wander and you can feel free and safe is nostalgic, then I guess it is nostalgic, you know.
where that's taken away usually today.
Yeah, well, that's the point here, is that, you know, there's pictures, and I showed earlier of the, you know, an active shooter drill
Right,
out west of children all gathered in, you know, which reminds me of, you know, the atom bomb.
yeah, the nuclear one,
Yeah, yeah.
under the
Yeah,
desk.
probably
right.
equally as foolish in the end in terms of the
Right.
chances for it to happen, but I wonder what I guess the primary question of the book is, I wonder what we've lost when children don't feel the sense of safety
Okay,
and the sense of privacy and the sense of wonder and allowing the imagination to run. And when you look at what that has meant for us as a nation, as a culture, was come out of that, when children are able to have their imaginations run. And that is a primary theme of the book as well, to show what we're talking about some of the inventions that came out of the minds of teenagers. And, you know, the radio and television basically really were invented by children experimenting with wirelesses and as teenagers. That is, you know, FM radio, the image detector for television was inspired by Bible Farnsworth, who was himself inspired by the crop lines out in the farms out out west. So you wonder how many of those things that were great, you know, solved great problems and led to great fun and joy in terms of popular culture and all that, how much we've lost if children are not able to imagine something. Because when we become adults, we no longer have that imagination.
and I so agree with you, and we have this joke with my friends. I agree with you, but I'm conflicted because I remember, you remember those metal jungle gyms that we all at a certain age used to crawl
Yeah,
on?
yeah.
I always wonder how we didn't all die.
Yeah.
Some horrible death crashing through the metal bars, but that was the point, is now, you know, there was this push for safety, and then they put the rubber mats on, and you know, they did ergonomics and all this stuff, but we always sort of chuckled that none of us died from this, you know. And what do we learn from taking those risks, walking without holding onto your hands along these, I mean, today parents would have a heart attack, right? But so there's a cocooning, or is there, right? I'm just saying from my perspective. But what you just said, I would challenge you on, because with the internet, with the sophistication in some ways in education, in the social media realm, you're hearing about all these students, they are in high school and they're inventing things for sustainability or discovering something within the science or the technical sector. Do you know what I mean? There are universities now are partnering up with science and engineering and technology, and these at a very young age, these students are almost turning professional. Forget being students; they're already moving into the professional sector. So I don't know how much of it is perception versus what, because my gut agrees with you. But when I step back and I say, but are we over romanticizing our childhood era? You know, if you think of World War II and the Brits were sending the kids out outside of London. I mean, there was not a sense of safety, or we're just talking about the Americans, but I'm conflicted with my gut, but also I stand back saying, is this every generation saying this?
Yeah, no, I can see where that would be a question. I would argue actually, though, that all the sciences that you just referenced, and I'm not saying that any categorical thing is at work here, but it certainly there are generalities that can be made. Are data-driven achievements.
True.
They tend to be that the students you're saying are excelling and are inventing new things, are inventing them out of data-driven knowledge.
Mhm.
And that is predictable. That's the predictable sciences, right? That's things
Fair
that
enough.
because things went this way,
Yeah.
we can predict that they will go that way.
Mhm.
And the data sets creating predictable behaviors are the sort of science of the moment for us. That's what happens to us every time we go onto the internet. That's what happens every time that we buy something. It's what happens in spades now that children go onto TikTok and other social media, and the algorithms based off of what they're doing manipulate their thinking in order to be able
It's very
to.
narrow.
Yes, very narrow, and it's very repeatable.
Right.
And I would argue that the
Yeah,
imagination that we lose
Yeah.
is the unrepeatable imagination.
Yeah.
It's the stuff.
Spontaneous.
Was that
It's
the
spontaneous.
spontaneous, the lack of the irrational,
Discovery.
the irrational, not
Yeah.
the rational, it's the irrational, right?
Okay.
And that's more indicative of a child's mind and a teenager's mind than it is an adult mind. What we're seeing in the achievements that you're referencing are almost adultification of achievement. And I'm open to thinking about it differently, but I think that's one of the great crimes of our media-driven age is the data sets that are algorithms that are.
You said it well, and I wanted to put that out as challenge.
Yeah.
The other thing is my daughter is neurodiverse is the term which they use. And I think about how our generation kind of, if you remember when we romanticized the 50s and maybe even the 60s, where I remember, and then I was in high school, you'd wear the penny loafers and you'd wear the,
Yeah,
the cable sweater, the preppy handbook, if you
Yeah,
remember all that.
yeah.
And it was like, we would look back at the 50s as sort of this idolized way, if you will, about the dress, the culture. And I remember having a really profound conversation with my grandmother. And she said, it wasn't all Leave It to Beaver. I mean, it wasn't
Yeah.
all perfect. We
Yeah.
had strife and stress. And the reason I say that is you look at now versus when I was growing up, and everyone was homogenized. You had to fit in, you had to be like everybody else. Whereas now I look at my daughter's generation and they're much more accepting of people with different abilities or disabilities.
Mm.
Or are they? Again, I raise this question because you're dealing with
Yeah.
racism too.
yeah,
We've got a lot more activities too, so there's
True.
a lot more planned activities now.
yeah,
I know with fourth grades, and you do the same with yours.
Right.
Where pick something, whatever is music, art, whatever the venue may be, athletics, acting, whatever it may be.
Right.
That they get channelized early. It's almost like they're a pro athlete when they start out and they
yeah.
They
pick
don't
one
get to
sport.
choose
And,
as much. They're
Yeah.
directed is what you
yeah,
said.
well, I think it's more planned and organized activities
Mhm.
than when I grew up. I know I
By
played.
adults.
So I'm
By
gonna
adults, yes.
jump in if I
Yeah.
may. I
Yeah.
have the honor of holding the beautiful book, which we have here
Yeah.
to sign, and we
Thank you.
obviously
Sorry,
can buy as well.
That's why I came in so late. I was so passionate.
And so thank you very much. Please join me in thanking Todd very
Yes.
much.
Thank you.